Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a concept that's maybe more fundamental than you might first think. Knowledge by acquaintance.
hmm
What does it actually mean to, truly know something just by, well, encountering it?
Right.
That's really our mission today. We've got some fascinating material, and we're looking particularly at a fresh perspective from Uriah Kriegel's 2025 paper, What is Knowledge by Acquaintance?
It's a great piece. Really gets you thinking.
Yeah, so we want to unpack what this kind of knowledge is, why it actually matters for how we understand things, and introduce Kriegel's sort of alternative view to the, let's say, traditional picture.
And we'll definitely need to touch on that distinction people often make.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Between this direct knowing by acquaintance and the more maybe familiar knowing that what philosophers call propositional knowledge.
Knowing facts versus knowing things,
Right.
people, experiences.
Precisely. Okay, let's dive right in.
That sounds good. So for a long time, the whole discussion about knowledge by acquaintance, it's been really shaped by Bertrand Russell.
He's kind of the starting point for this, isn't he?
Definitely. And what's interesting is he actually gave us, well, maybe two different ways to think about it.
Okay.
The first one, Kriegel labels it knowledge by acquaintance via negativa.
Via negativa. So defining it by what it's not.
Sort of, yeah. The core idea is that we can know some things in a way that just doesn't depend, logically speaking, on knowing any facts or truths about them. It's knowledge that can stand on its own.
Okay. Logically independent. How does that work in practice? Russell had an example, right?
He did. The classic neighbor-mayor example. It really helps nail down this idea.
Go on.
Okay, so imagine you know your neighbor. You see her, you recognize her face, maybe you chat sometimes, you definitely know her.
Right. Familiarity.
But you have absolutely no idea she's also the mayor of the town.
Oh, okay.
So Russell says, your knowledge of her, just that basic acquaintance, doesn't logically require you to know the fact she is the mayor.
Even though knowing her as your neighbor does depend on the fact she is my neighbor.
Exactly. Knowing her as something involves a proposition. But the basic acquaintance, he argues, doesn't. And that logical part is really crucial.
Right. Because someone might think, well, I always know something about the person I'm acquainted with, like she's a person or she has brown hair.
Precisely. But Russell's point is about logical independence. Even if you do happen to know some facts, like she's a woman, your fundamental acquaintance with her as an individual isn't logically built on knowing that fact. You could, hypothetically, be acquainted with her without knowing that specific proposition.
Okay, so it's a kind of foundational knowing, separate from knowing truths about the thing.
That's the idea. And Kriegel takes this and sort of formalizes Russell's first definition.
How does he put it?
Basically, S knows by acquaintance X if, first, S knows X, and second, there's no proposition, no fact P, such that if S didn't know that P, S wouldn't know X.
So the knowledge of X doesn't hinge on knowing any particular fact.
Exactly. It's about that core non-propositional grasp.
Okay, so a bedrock kind of knowing. Not knowing that something is true, but just knowing the thing itself. But you said Russell had another angle.
Yes, the second way, which Kriegel calls knowledge by acquaintance via positiva.
So defining it by what it is this time.
Right. This focuses much more on the idea of knowledge as a direct, unmediated awareness of something.
Unmediated, okay.
And this is where Russell gets quite restrictive, actually, because for him, you couldn't have this kind of direct acquaintance with, say, your laptop or, a tree outside.
Really, not with ordinary objects.
No, he thought it was limited to more sort of basic constituents of experience, things like sense data.
Sense data, like the raw feeling of red or the sound of a bell.
Exactly. Those immediate sensory qualities, also universals, like the property of redness itself, maybe. And perhaps, he thought, our own selves, but not everyday material objects.
Wow, okay. So it's a very specific kind of awareness he's talking about.
Very specific. And another key point here. Russell insisted it's not knowledge based on acquaintance, but knowledge that is acquaintance.
What's the difference there?
Think about how we talk about knowledge by justified true belief.
Yeah.
The by tells you what constitutes the knowledge, right?
Okay, yeah.
So for Russell's second definition, when you know something by acquaintance, it's because you are acquainted with it. That immediate awareness itself is the knowledge. It's not like the awareness leads to some other knowledge state.
The awareness is the knowledge state.
Precisely.
And being acquainted, for Russell, what did that mean technically?
He described it as a direct cognitive relation, an immediate awareness that isn't filter through or dependent on being aware of something else.
Okay. Is there an example for that?
Yeah, he used one involving a refrigerator, I think. How about you hear your fridge making that low humming sound like...
Familiar sound.
You're aware of the refrigerator, sure.
Yeah.
But Russell would argue your awareness of the fridge is mediated by your awareness of the sound.
Right. I know the fridge is there because I hear the sound.
Exactly. But the sound itself, that gurg sense datum, that, for Russell, could be something you're directly acquainted with. A pure, unmediated bit of sensory input.
So no middleman in the awareness.
Right. And crucially, this awareness also shouldn't be mediated by conceptualization. Meaning you're aware of X itself, not aware of X as something specific, like as a fridge noise.
Ah. So even if I recognize the sound as the fridge, the initial raw awareness of the sound itself before I categorize it, that's the acquaintance.
That's the idea Russell was getting at. It's a kind of preconceptual awareness.
Yeah.
You're just presented with the raw sensory quality.
Okay. So Kriegel pulls this together, too, into a definition.
He does. He formulates a definition of Russellian acquaintance first. You're acquainted with X if, 1, you're aware of X. 2, there's no other thing, Y, such that you're aware of X because you're aware of Y.
No mediated awareness.
Right. And 3, there's no conceptualization process involved. You're not aware of X in virtue of thinking about it in a certain way.
Got it. Doubly unmediated, in a sense.
Exactly. And from that definition of acquaintance, Kriegel then gets Russell's second definition of knowledge by acquaintance. It's basically just being in that state of...
So KBA is just being acquainted in this specific Russellian sense.
Yeah. You're directly aware, no intermediaries, no conceptual filter.
And why does Kriegel bother separating these two Russellian definitions, the via negativa and via positiva?
Ah, good question. He thinks it's important because you might, say, agree with the general idea of the first definition that there's some kind of knowledge that isn't propositional.
Okay.
But you might disagree with the specifics of the second definition, the via positiva one. You might not buy into Russell's whole picture of sense data and direct, unmediated awareness having those specific features.
So separating them allows you to keep the core idea of non-propositional knowledge without necessarily signing up for all of Russell's specific metaphysical or psychological baggage about what acquaintance is.
Exactly. Kriegel wants to carve out space for different ways of understanding what that non-propositional knowledge might involve.
Okay. This seems like a good place to pivot then. How does this lead to what Kriegel calls the classical conception?
Right. So Kriegel sees this classical conception as developing from Russell's ideas, particularly the via positiva one, and being carried forward by more contemporary philosophers like Duncan, Atik, Ranalli, Justina.
So what are the key features of this classical conception?
Kriegel identifies two core theses, relationalism and infallibilism.
Relationalism and infallibilism. Let's take relationalism first.
Okay. So as we touched on, Russell saw acquaintance as this direct cognitive relation. The key thing for relationalism is that this is understood as a primitive real relation.
Okay. Unpack primitive and real relation.
Real relation means it absolutely requires both the subject, you, and the object, the thing you're acquainted with, to actually exist. It's not like thinking about a unicorn, where the thought exists, but the unicorn doesn't. For a real relation, both ends have to be real.
Got it. Like the relation taller than requires two existing things to compare.
Exactly. And primitive means this relation isn't built out of anything simpler. It's a fundamental direct link between the subject and the object. It can't be broken down into, say, representing something plus some other condition.
So it's a direct, unanalyzable connection that guarantees the existence of the thing you're connected to.
That's the core of KBA relationalism, as Kriegel lays it out. You know X by acquaintance if and only if you stand in this special kind of primitive real relation to X.
And this immediately contrasts with any view where acquaintance might involve, say, a mental representation, right? Because a representation could, in theory, exist even if the thing it represents doesn't.
Precisely. The classical view, rooted in relationalism, strongly rejects that possibility for genuine acquaintance.
Okay, so that's relationalism. What about the second thesis, infallibilism?
This flows pretty naturally from relationalism, actually. The idea is that knowledge by acquaintance provides certainty. It rules out doubt about the existence of the thing you're acquainted with.
Ah, like Russell saying you can doubt the table, but not the sense data.
Exactly that quote. If you are genuinely acquainted with, say, a particular patch of red sense datum, according to this view, you cannot possibly be mistaken about its existence right then. The acquaintance itself guarantees it's there. There's no gap for error to creep in.
Because the relation just wouldn't exist if the object wasn't there.
Right. Acquaintance cannot miss its mark in that sense. Now, Kriegel, it might seem weird to talk about fallibility or infallibility for something that isn't a belief or a statement.
Yeah, usually we talk about beliefs being true or false, fallible or infallible.
Right. But he suggests we can think about semantic success even for this objectual awareness. Success just means the object X exists. Failure means it doesn't.
Okay, so semantic success is existence.
Yeah. So infallibilism about KDA means that if you know X by acquaintance, then semantic success is guaranteed. X must exist.
And how does Kriegel formulate this?
He draws a parallel with infallibilism about propositional knowledge, using a formulation from David Lewis, and comes up with KDA infallibilism. It says, roughly, you know X by acquaintance only if X exists in every possible situation that feels exactly the same to you, perceptually and introspectively, as the actual situation does.
Whoa. So if it feels like you're acquainted with X and you are actually acquainted with X, then in any other scenario that feels identical, X must also exist. There's no possibility of a perfect fake that feels the same but where X is absent.
That's the strength of the infallibilist claim tied to the classical conception. And as you said, it really seems to follow from relationalism. If acquaintance is that real relation, it just can't happen if the object isn't there.
Okay, so that's the classical picture. A primitive, real relation that guarantees the existence of its object, making the knowledge infallible.
Exactly. And this is the picture Kriegel wants to offer an alternative to.
Right. He wants to defend what he calls a lightweight KBA.
Yes, a version that is representationalist and, crucially, fallibilist.
So rejecting both core tenets of the classical view.
Well, certainly rejecting the strong link between them. He explicitly denies KBA infallibilism. He proposes KBA fallibilism instead. It is possible to know X by acquaintance, even if, in some other possible situation that feels exactly the same to you, X doesn't exist.
So you could have an experience that qualifies as knowledge by acquaintance in the actual world, but a subjectively identical experience in another possible world that doesn't qualify, perhaps because the object isn't there.
Precisely. That opens the door for error, for fallibility, which relationalism seemed designed to exclude.
And his main claim is that this lightweight version can still do the job.
Yeah, his central thesis is that a notion of KBA without insisting on relationalism or infallibilism can still perform the essential theoretical functions that philosophers have wanted KBA for.
Interesting. He even mentions KBA pluralism.
Yeah, he floats the idea that maybe there isn't just one kind of KBA. Perhaps there's room for both a heavyweight relational kind and his lightweight representational kind.
Okay, so how does he build this lightweight representational alternative? He's going against folks like Fumerton, Duncan, Atik, Justina, who really emphasize that primitive real relation.
Right. He needs to offer a different account of the core thing, awareness itself. His approach is to give a representational account of awareness.
Okay, what's his hypothesis?
His philosophical hypothesis, as he calls it, is that being aware of X is having a certain kind of mental representation of X.
A mental representation, and this representation has specific features.
Yeah, 3 key ones. First, it has to be veridical.
Meaning?
In this context, it just means the representation is successful in its objectual content. The object it represents, X, actually exists. It's the opposite of a hallucination, where you might represent something that isn't there.
Okay, so veridicality replaces the guaranteed existence from the real relation. It's about accuracy of the representation.
Exactly. Second, there's subjective indistinguishability.
Which means
For any genuine awareness of X, which is veridical, there's a possible non-veridical state, a seeming awareness that feels exactly the same from the inside.
this is the key to fallibilism. You can't tell just from the feeling whether it's real awareness or merely seeming awareness.
Precisely. That possibility of a subjectively identical failure is built into the account.
Okay, veridicality, subjective indistinguishability. What's the third feature?
This is maybe the most distinctive one, presence phenomenology.
Presence phenomenology. What's that?
He describes it as a sui generis, a unique kind of feel the feeling of being in direct contact with reality, of the object being present to you.
A primitive feeling? So hard to define directly.
Yeah, he acknowledges it's a phenomenal primitive, but he gives us 4 ways to kind of triangulate it to get a handle on the feeling he means.
Okay, like what?
First, contrast the feeling of actually seeing a uniform blue screen versus just thinking about a blue screen.
There's a vividness, a presence in the seeing that's missing in the thinking.
Right, definitely different feelings. Second, contrasts perceiving a juicy strawberry. The look, the smell, maybe the feel versus just vividly imagining or visualizing that same strawberry. Again, the perception feels like it puts you in contact differently.
Okay. Imagination feels less present.
Third, think about the correctness conditions. A perceptual experience of a strawberry seems to implicitly claim the strawberry is really there in a way a hallucination doesn't, even though the hallucination is vivid, that claim of real presence.
Mm-hmm.
And fourth, he suggests it's the kind of feeling that a naive realist, someone who does believe perception involves a real relation, would associate with that relation. It's that feeling of direct contact, even if Kriegel ultimately grounds it in representation.
So it's that raw sense of this is real, this is here now.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So putting these together, Kriegel defines awareness as a mental representation of X that is veridical, 2 has this presence phenomenology, and 3 allows for subjectively indistinguishable non-vertical counterparts.
Okay. And he contrasts this with seeming awareness, which lacks verticality.
Exactly. Seeming awareness has the presence phenomenology, but isn't veridical, like a hallucination. Mere seeming awareness is when it's only non-veridical.
Got it. So from this definition of awareness, how does he define his lightweight KBA?
Okay, so KBA light, as he calls it, is when S has a mental representation, M of X, such that I am is vertical, 2M has presence phenomenology.
So it's genuine awareness based on his definition.
Right, and then adds the Russellian conditions we saw earlier, but apply to this representational awareness. 3, there's no other such awareness M of some Y, such that S has M in virtue of having M. And 4, there's no conceptualization process C, such that S has M partly in virtue of undergoing C.
So it takes his representational definition of awareness and adds the doubly unmediated conditions from Russell's second definition.
Precisely. It's unmediated awareness, but the awareness itself is understood representationally infallibly.
Which means straight away that KBA infallibilism, the classical idea, must be false on this view.
Yes. Because of the subjective indistinguishability clause in the definition of awareness, you could have this KBA light state, this veridical representation with presence, etc., but there's always a possible scenario, feeling identical, where the representation is not veridical. So existence isn't guaranteed across all subjectively identical scenarios.
Okay, so we have this alternative picture. Knowledge by acquaintance is a veridical, unmediated, in those two senses, mental representation with a special presence feel, but it's fallible because a non-veridical state could feel the same.
That's the core of KBA light.
Now, obviously, people who like the classical view might have objections.
Indeed. And Kriegel anticipates a couple of big ones.
What's the first?
The first is basically, how is this even knowledge? If it's just a representation, and it doesn't involve predication, making a claim that something is true, how can it be knowledge? Knowledge usually involves, well, propositions.
Yeah, that seems like a fair question. If it's not knowing that, what kind of knowing is it?
Kriegel's response is that, yes, it's a different sense of knowledge from propositional knowledge. It's knowledge as contact with reality. He argues that achieving a veridical representation, one that accurately reflects what's there, is itself an epistemic achievement.
An achievement? How so?
Because failure is possible. Unlike the classical view where acquaintance guarantees success, here, the representation could have been non-veridical, a hallucination. So when it is veridical, when you successfully represent reality this way, that counts as a cognitive success, a form of knowledge. The possibility of error actually highlights the achievement of getting it right.
Okay, so it's knowledge in the sense of successful, accurate representation of reality, made significant by the fact it could have failed.
That's his argument.
What's the second big objection?
It's about the name. How can you call this knowledge by acquaintance? The term acquaintance, especially after Russell, strongly suggests that primitive real relation. Isn't using the term misleading if you're actually offering a representational account?
Right. It sounds like he's co-opting the term for something different.
Kriegel has a two-pronged reply. First, he points back to Russell's initial motivation, the via negativa idea. Russell was fundamentally interested in non-propositional knowledge, and Kriegel argues his representational account is an account of non-propositional awareness, so it fits that original goal, even if it drops the specific real relation part of Russell's later thought.
So connect it to the broader aim, not just the specific mechanism Russell proposed later.
Exactly. And second, he introduces that terminology, heavyweight awareness for the classical, relational view, and lightweight awareness for his representational view.
Okay.
So you can then say there's heavyweight KBA, the classical kind, and lightweight KBA, his kind. His claim is that lightweight KBA, based on lightweight awareness, is a valid and useful concept.
So he's acknowledging the traditional meaning, but carving out space for his own related but distinct concept under a slightly modified name.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so if we accept, for the sake of argument, that this lightweight KBA is a coherent concept, the really big question becomes, can it do the work? Can it play the theoretical roles that proponents of classical KBA said required that heavyweight relational view?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And Kriegel argues, yes, it can. He looks at three main theoretical jobs identified for classical KBA.
All right, let's take them one by one. What's the first?
Explaining successful fine-grained behavior, like Duncan's example of Umberto smoothly navigating a crowded restaurant. Duncan argued this needs KBA of the obstacles combined with desires.
So you need direct awareness of the chairs and tables to avoid bumping into them. How does Kriegel's view handle this?
Kriegel argues that having a veridical lightweight awareness, a successful representation with presence phenomenology of those chairs and tables, seems perfectly adequate to explain the successful navigation. Well, the veridicality ensures your representation matches reality, which explains why your actions based on it are successful. That addresses the knowledge aspect needed for success. And the fine-grained content of the representation explains why your movements are so precise and adaptive. You represent the exact shapes, locations, orientations.
So the accurate, detailed representation guides the fine-grained action. Seems plausible.
And Kriegel actually argues his view has an advantage here.
Oh, how so?
It can explain both success and failure using the same mechanism. Consider Duncan's twin Umberto scenario, where a demon makes twin Umberto have an experience subjectively identical to Umberto's, but it's non-veridical, the chairs aren't really there.
Okay, like a hallucination.
Twin Umberto would presumably try to move in the same fine-grained way as Umberto because his experience feels the same, but he'd fail miserably, bumping into things or grasping at air. Kriegel says his account explains this perfectly. Twin Umberto has the same representational content with presence phenomenology, explaining the attempted behavior, but it's non-veridical, explaining the failure. The classical relational view struggles more, perhaps, to explain why twin Umberto acts that way if there's no relation to anything.
Interesting. So the representational view handles both the matching reality cases and the mismatching reality cases more smoothly.
That's the argument.
Okay, what's the second theoretical role for KBA?
This one's about the epistemic value of contact with reality. Ranalli, for instance, argues that KBA provides this unique, intrinsically good connection to the world.
And intuitively, contact with reality sounds like it fits better with a real relation, doesn't it?
It does seem to at first glance. But Kriegel pushes back. He says the phrase contact with reality isn't actually transparent in its meaning. Does it have to mean a primitive real relation?
Good point. What's his alternative?
He points out that even on his view, lightweight awareness is a form of contact with reality when it's veridical. Achieving a veridical representation means your mental state accurately corresponds to an existing object. That's a connection. And crucially, the veridicality itself depends on the object existing. So there's a real dependency there.
So the contact is achieved through the representational accuracy, which relies on the object's existence.
Yes. Plus, remember the presence phenomenology, that unique feeling of the object being present. Kriegel argues that this phenomenal quality is precisely what gives lightweight awareness the feel of direct contact. So it delivers both the factual connection, via veridicality, and the felt sense of connection, via presence phenomenology.
Okay. What about Ranelli's intuition about seeing a parrot versus hearing testimony about it? Doesn't seeing feel like better contact?
Kriegel agrees there's a difference, but locates it slightly differently. He suggests both seeing the parrot and hearing the testimony involve KBA. You have lightweight KBA of the parrot in one case, and lightweight KBA of the testimony that sounds the speaker in the other. The crucial difference, he argues, is whether you have KDA of the truth maker for the belief there is a parrot. When you see the parrot itself is the truth maker, and you have KBA of it. When you hear testimony, the testimony is what you have KBA of, and that testimony then supports your belief about the parrot, whose truth maker you don't have KBA of.
Ah, so it's about whether the object of your direct awareness is the thing that makes your belief true.
That's his proposed explanation for that intuition.
Clever. Okay, third theoretical role.
Knowledge of qualities. Think about qualia, the raw feels of experience, like the redness of red or the sharpness of pain. Philosophers like Attic and Justina argue we need KBA to explain how we know these qualities directly, in a way that goes beyond just knowing facts about them.
Like Mary, the color scientist, who knows all the physics of red but has never seen it, she seems to lack a kind of knowledge.
Exactly. Attic uses the thought experiment about Edenic colors. Perfect, pure colors, arguing someone in Eden who experiences them has KBA of these qualities, making them epistemically better off than us. Justina focuses on knowing our own phenomenal states through introspection.
And how does Kriegel argue lightweight KBA can handle this?
Pretty straightforwardly, actually. He argues that having a veridical introspective representation of a quale, like redness, which has presence phenomenology, is exactly what constitutes knowing that quality directly. It gives you the what it's like in a way factual knowledge doesn't.
So the lightweight awareness of the quail does the job?
Yes. Regarding Attic's Eden, Kriegel proposes we compare Eden 1 with relational KBA and Eden 2 with lightweight KBA. He argues counterparts in Eden 2, with veridical representations of Edenic colors plus presence, seem just as epistemically well off compared to us as those in Eden 1. There's no clear epistemic advantage that forces us to prefer the relational account.
And the problem in Attic's semi-Eden scenario.
Kriegel suggests the issue isn't the underlying metaphysics, relation versus representation, but simply the lack of the knowledge itself, however it's realized. Semi-Dedenians just don't have the awareness, lightweight or heavyweight.
Okay. And for Justina's point about knowing our own phenomenal states.
Again, Kriegel argues that a veridical introspective impression with presence phenomenology accounts for the special knowledge we seem to have of our own feelings and experiences.
Does Justina have a counter-argument based on introspection seeming infallible? Does that favor the relational view?
That's a potential point Justina might raise. If introspection is infallible, it might seem like it requires a direct relation. Kriegel offers three responses. First, maybe introspection isn't strictly infallible. Second, even if it is highly reliable, maybe veridical representation could be, say, nomologically infallible, guaranteed by laws of nature, without needing a primitive relation. And third, there's always KBA pluralism. Maybe introspection is relational, but other forms of KBA, like perception, are representational.
So he has defenses ready even if introspection turns out to be special.
He does. So yeah, the overall argument is that this lightweight representational fallibilist KBA can step into the theoretical shoes of the classical relational infallibilist version.
Okay, so summing up, Kriegel makes a pretty compelling case, you think, that we don't necessarily need that heavyweight picture of acquaintance, that a representational view can account for non-propositional knowledge, fine-grained behavior, contact with reality, and knowledge of qualities.
I think he presents a very strong, detailed argument for that conclusion, yes. It really challenges some long-held assumptions.
And there's a final implication you mentioned, something for us to chew on.
Yeah, and it's quite a big one, I think. If Kriegel is right, if this lightweight KBA is fundamental, maybe even underpinning propositional knowledge,
Okay.
and if this lightweight KBA, by definition, involves phenomenal consciousness, specifically that presence phenomenology component,
Right, that essential feeling.
then it seemed to follow that you can't have knowledge by acquaintance without consciousness. And if all knowledge ultimately depends in some way on KBA,
Then you can't have any knowledge without consciousness.
that seems to be the logical chain. No propositional knowledge without KBA, no KBA without consciousness, therefore, no knowledge without consciousness.
Wow. That ties knowledge directly to subjective experience in a very deep way.
It does. It suggests that maybe consciousness isn't just some add-on, but is actually essential for any kind of knowing grasp of the world, or even ourselves.
So the provocative thought for our listeners is really about the fundamental role of consciousness in our epistemic lives. What is the nature of our awareness, and how deeply is it tied to our ability to know anything at all?
Exactly. How does that feeling of presence relate to being able to claim we know something? It's a deep question.
Definitely something worth pondering further. Thanks for diving into this complex topic with us on the Deep Dive.
My pleasure. It was fascinating.